How's it going, everybody? We are here for week 2 of Mon Hills Audio Hour. Not week 2. What am I saying? We've been here for 6 weeks at this point. Wow. 6 whole weeks. And now, with this 6th week, we are going to be talking about several things. We're going to be talking about session layouts. We're going to be talking about routing. And then right at the tail end, we're going to be talking about fader balancing. So basically, the final steps between your editing process and the beginning of your mix process. Really into the very beginning stages of the mix process. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and switch over here. And we will go ahead and start. So what we have here is a session. If you were working as an independent mixer and somebody else recorded this project and edited it, this is kind of what you would get if you were tasked with mixing this, or if you are the one who has recorded and edited and now is going to mix this. This is what you should have before you start mixing. You've got all of your audio channels laid out in a logical order. In this case, from left to right: master, drums, bass, guitars, lead vocal, vocal doubling, and then a whole mess of background vocals. You've got all of your pan pots and faders at 0, or in the case of the stereo channels, hard left and right. All of your editing has been completed. So you've got all of your groups made that you need for all of the parts that have multiple perspectives or similar parts. You have all of your dead space trimmed. You do see some dead space in this, and that is just so as you send this off to mix, like if this were going to a different engineer to be mixed, they all have a common starting point and are all just one contiguous track, so none of your cuts are still in the audio, so everything is cohesive. But you know, in the editing process, the dead space would have been trimmed, so now that is, anytime you see dead space, it is true silence. There's no noise in it. Any clip gain adjustments have been made as necessary. Everything has been rhythmically aligned. Everything has been phase aligned. Anything that was out of tune has been tuned. And you've got markers dropped so that the mix engineer knows the sections of the song and can inform his choices and playback accordingly. So yeah, at this point, the very early stages of the mix can begin. The session is now laid out. Color coding is applied, and you know, this is how I like to have it. Obviously, everybody's gonna have their own version of that, but tracks are titled, so everything is nice and pretty and organized. And at this point, you can move into the routing process. So let's talk about that. Right now, we have all of our audio clips, and they each have their own channel. Each one of these channel strips here corresponds to one audio track. All right. So in the case of this session, we have 38 discrete audio tracks. And if you want to count stereo, we have 40 discrete audio tracks. All right. Processing is going to be applied to these parts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to put unique processing on all 40 of our audio channels. That would get, one, really time consuming, two, really repetitive, as some of these parts are similar, and three, if you're mixing entirely digitally, it would really get taxing on your CPU levels if you tried to individually process each of these. So routing allows us to take these 40 channels and control their path to the master bus. So maybe let's talk about this like from a conceptual level first. Like I said, each one of these strips corresponds to a single audio track that has some musical part on it. All of these strips have the capacity to be processed on these insert points, are placed in the stereo field with these pan pots, and had their relative levels set with the faders. After the fader, they are what is called summed, meaning they are combined, and they all come to the master bus as a left channel and a right channel. So we're taking 40 channels and combining them into 2 channels. That is, by definition, what mixing is. So as it is right now, by default, all of these channels are contributing directly to the master bus as they are right now, which in the case of a mix this size, or mostly any mix, is not the cleanest way to do that. It's not the easiest way or the most efficient way to manage your mix. So in order to prevent us from having to process each individual channel before it contributes to the master, using routing, we can control, we can basically break these channels into sections, using that to process them together before they contribute to the master. This will start to make sense as I get into the demonstration, but suffice it to say, this if you begin with this with these editing steps in mind, as you build your mix from a processing level, this will just make it easier and more convenient and more efficient. So we can conceptualize routing, the process of routing, as adding bus channels to submix your audio channels before that submix is sent to the master bus. Routing is also used on these send points here to send audio in parallel to other input channels for parallel processing, which we'll also get into here in a minute. So basically what we're going to be doing is creating other master channels, master buses, for specific groups of these audio channels. And it's kind of going to align with how we have our groups set up here in our mix and edit groups. That is sort of going to inform some of our routing decisions too. So I'm just going to get straight into it. So as I'm looking from left to right, I see the first 8 channels are drums. We got a kick drum, a top snare mic, a bottom snare mic, a hi-hat, a rack tom, a floor tom, a stereo overhead, and a mono room perspective. But all of those combine to form the full image of the drum set. If I played back all of these drum channels right now, they would sound like this. And So what we're listening to right now is everything essentially in mono, all the faders at unity. And we can hear how this isn't necessarily the most cohesive sounding thing. It doesn't sound like one player playing one instrument. It sounds like 8 discrete inputs. And that's not what we want. So it will be helpful for the sake of the mix to give ourselves the option to treat all of these drum inputs as one instrument, as a collective drum set. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a stereo auxiliary input. And we're going to call that drums. And in terms of color coding, I like to just make my bus channels a little bit darker than the input channels, just so your eye catches it. All right, so we have this, but now we have to get the audio into that. And the way we do that is with our routing section here where it says I/O. So within any digital audio workstation, you are going to have a certain number of what are called buses. Buses are most easily conceptualized as virtual cables. So just try to imagine in your head, I've got whatever audio clip is assigned to this channel, and it's coming out of this channel. And right now it's defaulted to going out to the master bus, but I don't want it to go there. I want it to go to my drum channel first in this case. So I need to take that output and connect it via a virtual cable to the input of this new bus channel we've just made. So first we're going to take this bus and we're going to assign it. We're going to assign the input telling it where to look. So in default Pro Tools, you've got 24 buses, and because this is a stereo channel, they're automatically linked, odd on the left and even on the right. And since we're building our session from left to right, I'm just going to start with bus 1 and 2. All right, so now this channel knows to read whatever is coming through the virtual bus 1 and 2. So if I hit play, I'm still not seeing metering over here. I'm seeing metering here, meaning the audio is coming through, but it's not getting here just yet. And that's because we've assigned an input, but we haven't assigned any outputs to feed bus 1 and 2. So we are going to do that. So with all of our drum channels, we're going to take their output and assign it to bus 1 and 2. So now it's no longer going to the master fader, but before it goes to it's no longer going to the master fader, it's going to our drum bus, which we have created, and then combined, and then the combined stereo signal from the drum bus is then contributing to the master mix. Just going over, and now all of these channels are assigned to our bus. So now we should see metering here when we hit play. And we do. And just to prove that that is the middleman between the channel strips and the master bus, if we hit mute, and they go away. If we unmute it. So this now controls the total drum contribution to the master mix. That's not to say that we won't apply processing to the individual channels. We still will. But now, as we get into a little bit later in this episode, we'll see that we now have the option to apply processing to the entirety of the drum kit. Like, say we wanted to, like we talked about in last week's episode with compression, say we wanted to have the entire drum set being compressed in equal measure by the same compressor, rather than inserting the same compressor with the same parameters on each of these channels, running it 8 times, we can run it once and have all the channels going through it. Again, this is more efficient from a time perspective and from a processing power perspective. Okay, so we have created this. Now there's one other thing I would like to create for the same reason, for sake of efficiency in processing. Now, if we look at our drum set, we've got a kick drum and a snare drum, but the snare drum has two microphones on it. It has a top mic and a bottom mic. But the combination of those two things, those two perspectives, serve to create the overall snare drum sound, or rather the close mic snare drum sound. More than likely, you're not going to want to process your top microphone differently from your bottom microphone. You're going to want to set a blend of the two and then leave it, and then that becomes your snare drum sound, and you want to process the snare drum sound as a whole. So these can use their own bus. So I create a mono, because I want my snare in mono, a mono auxiliary input, and call it snare. Now, same process. This needs to be fed. Now keep in mind, we're already using bus 1 and 2, so those are tied up with drums, so we can't use those. We're going to use bus 3 because it's in mono. We just need the 1. And then we're going to assign the snare top mic and the snare bottom mic to that bus. So now, see the metering? So it's now getting to our bus, and if we mute this, now you're just hearing the room perspectives. Now, keep in mind though, this is where it gets a little perhaps esoteric and multi-leveled here, is what have we just done? We've created this new channel. We've sent our snare audio to it. So now these two mics are being combined in this channel. But this channel is contributing to the master mix. So it's no longer hitting our drum bus. It's no longer part of it. We've taken it out of that. So now if we just listen to the drum bus, there would be no close snare mics in it. It would just be kick, hat, toms, and room mics. That's not what we want. We still want this to be part of the drum kit. So we've set our input of the bus channel, but now we also have to set our output to go to bus 1 and 2, which remember is our drum bus input. So now, yeah, so that's still all part of our drum set. All right, so that is about the extent of the routing that we need to happen on the drum kit. We move to our bass. Now, this is something that I've gotten in the habit of doing. It is perhaps a little unorthodox. I'm just going to show you for just the sake of showing you. I've gotten in the habit the last couple years of keeping my kick drum out of my drum bus and instead summing it with my bass inputs. So I have a separate mono bus for my kick and my bass, and then the rest of my drum kit goes to a drum bus. So I'm going to create another, again, you want your kick and your bass to be in mono, so another mono auxiliary input, and call it kick bass. So we need another mono bus. We've already used 1, 2, and 3, so we can go bus 4 and assign. We're going to take our kick drum out of the drum bus and assign it over here to the kick and bass as well. So now, so if we mute our drum bus, you still hear your kick and your bass over here. The reason I've gotten in the habit of doing that is, one, it helps the mono compatibility. Like it makes sure that your low end, your kick and your bass, stays out of the stereo field more than it should be. And also, if you think about it from a speaker operation perspective, you want the kick basically to be the front end attack of your bass, and you want your bass to be the pitch and sustain information of your kick. But you basically want those to become one instrument effectively, and you want it to be moving the same air at the same time at the speaker level. You want that speaker cone to be articulating with the kick and the bass in the same way. So I've found that this helps achieve that, and allows you to achieve a little bit of a better low end image and a stronger low end mix as everything's built on top of that. So, okay, we've got our drum bus, we've got our kick and bass bus. Then we got a bunch of guitars here. So if we flip over, we need to try to make sense of this. So we've got an electric guitar, we've got AC1, acoustic 1, mono, and then we've got an AC2 body and neck. So we got 2 mic perspectives on a second acoustic part, and then an AC lead, body and neck, 2 perspectives. So this channel is 1 part. This channel is 1 part. These 2 channels are 1 part, and these 2 channels are 1 part. So the electric guitar and the AC1 are single perspective, so they don't need to be bussed. They can be processed individually just fine. But we have 2 perspectives on these other 2 acoustic parts. So same as with the snare drum, we're going to create 2 new mono auxiliary inputs. Again, some people may want to process the body and the neck mic separately. For me, I've found that processing them together and treating them as the summation of that acoustic guitar's sound works better. It's also just easier from a mix perspective to think about it that way. And for that reason, I tend to make multiple guitar perspectives sum to a mono bus. So we've created these 2, and so we have AC2 and AC lead. Okay, so 2 more mono buses. We've used up to 4, so we'll make this one 5. Oh, did that wrong. Make this one 5, and this one 6, and then the AC2 outputs will go to 5, body and neck, and then to the AC lead will go to 6, body output, and neck output. And notice that the pan knobs disappear because this is summing to mono, so only the bus will control pan information. So if we check our metering, so everything is as it's supposed to be. But so across the course of this song, we have 4 discrete guitar parts. But in an effort to maybe exert a little bit more control over the totality of the guitar parts. Same with the drums. I might want to send all of my guitar mics to a guitar bus, which I will create. So we're going to make a stereo aux input. Call it guitars. We've used up to 6, so this will be fed by bus 7 and 8. And then we need to make the electric guitar go to 7, 8. The first acoustic guitar part that only has 1 perspective to 7 and 8. The bus for the second acoustic guitar part goes here. And the bus for the acoustic lead part goes there as well. So now we have all of our guitar parts coming with us. So far we've got drum bus, snare bus, kick and bass bus, all the guitars bust, a bus for this double perspective acoustic and this other double perspective acoustic. Now we move over to our vocals. We have just a single lead vocal and a single stereo doubling. So for that reason, there's really no reason to bus these, because you want your lead vocal, kind of like your kick and your bass, to stay in mono, and there's only one of it. So this doesn't need to be bussed. The processing can just stay directly on this channel, and there's only one stereo vocal information that's on lyric in this case, which is this doubling. So since there's only one of those, it doesn't need a bus either. But perhaps where bussing becomes the most important is in these ancillary parts like background vocals or strings or horns or whatever overdubbed parts you might have in addition to your rhythm section and your lead vocal. We have 20 channels of various background vocal parts. Some of them are doing similar things, some of them are not. So we're going to look through, you can kind of just tell by looking at the waveform what is a like part and what isn't. So if we look at, we have this one part, 3 tracks of this one part, and 3 tracks of this 2 part. We look at it and it is occurring at the same time everywhere. So we can infer that this is the same part, or in this case it's 2 notes in harmony, but singing the same rhythmic part. Then we scroll down, we have this 3 part. We notice that after its entrance, it's the same as the first 2 parts. So it's just, from an arrangement perspective, staggered entrance to come in at the second half of the second verse. And the same deal with this 4 part, a little bit after the 3rd part. But the first 12 channels, because it's 4-part harmony, just you can tell just by looking at the titling and the waveform where it happens. You have 4-part harmony, triple tracked, so 12 total tracks. That all is going to be processed together. Rather than trying to process 12 channels, we can process 1 channel, which is why routing makes your life easier. If we scroll down, we notice that we also have these counter parts, and we have 3-part harmony in the counter. So in that case, you might want that to be a little bit of a different mix because it's a different part. You can just tell by looking at the waveform. But if you want to listen, we can come over here. So on this 1 through 4 part, we have just an ooh, just a sustained syllable. But if we move to this counterpart, see we have this moving embellishment line. So we probably will want to make this 2 stereo buses, one for the just the sustained background vocal harmonies, and another one for this little counter embellishment harmony. So 2 stereo auxiliary inputs. Call this one BGs for backgrounds, and we'll call this one counter. We'll put this over here so there's some delineation. So we've used up to the first 8 buses, so now we're going to put the backgrounds on bus 9 and 10, and put the counters on 11 and 12, and then we go through. Unfortunately, on Pro Tools, or at least in the capacity that I've been able to find, there is not a way to group direct input-output routing. You can either route the tracks individually, one at a time, or hold down Alt and route every single track in the entire session to a particular output. But as far as I'm aware, there is not a way to like batch direct outputs or inputs. So that's not to say that one doesn't exist. I just don't know of it. So if anybody happens to know how to do that, feel free to enlighten me in the chat or in the comments. I'm sure there's some simple solution that some engineer out there is like face palming that I don't know. I've just destroyed any credibility I may have garnered over the course of this series, but hopefully you still bear with me here. Getting through our counterparts, assigning them to the bus on 11 and 12. Almost done. All right. So now, all in the correct place, as they should be. So with that, based on the audio that's in this session, that is about the extent of the routing that we would need, as far as I'm concerned, to achieve this mix. So now, instead of deciding how we want these BGs to sound, like on one channel and copying those processors onto all of these channels, we can just do all of them together on these two channels. So we have effectively turned 20 channels of audio into 2 channels. This also makes it a little bit easier on your computer, and we'll talk about this idea a little bit later, well, a lot later in our series here, but it also makes it easier on your computer. From a binary coding perspective, it is much easier for your computer to combine. Well, we've effectively turned this 40-channel mix into a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-channel mix. It's much easier for your computer to combine the codes of 7 channels than it is to combine the codes of 40 channels. So already, just by nature of what we've done, the mix is going to sound a little bit better, a little cleaner, a little bit more distinct in its parts, because we've added this extra stage before it all gets to its final 2 tracks. All right, so we have done our master routing, but now there's another step to this as well, where we might need some parallel processing, meaning wanting to have the same audio information in 2 places so that we can process it in 2 different ways. Let me show you what I mean. Predominantly where that occurs is in time-based effects, which I'll just go ahead and set up just so we can all see it. So when I mix, I typically will start with 4 time-based effect channels. I'll use kind of a shorter reverb, predominantly for my instruments, and everything will go through that in equal measure, but it's like vocals included, but it's predominantly for my instruments. And my reason for doing that is to sort of simulate the effect of all of these parts being recorded in the same room at the same time. It just makes it sound a little bit more cohesively in terms of its perceived space. So I use 1 short reverb. I'll usually bring up a what I call a slap delay, which is just a really fast delay, like on a fixed time value, really fast, almost imperceptible, predominantly for vocals or maybe solo parts like guitar solos or what have you. Just has a way of making a sound more distinct, making it perhaps a little clearer. If it's overdone, it can have the opposite effect, but when blended properly, I tend to like the effect that it adds. My third time-based effect is usually a longer reverb, reserved pretty much for vocals, lead parts like solos. Sometimes if it's like a ballad, maybe I'll put my snare or my reverb, or my snare or my toms through that longer reverb too in a little bit. But right, third time bass is a long reverb, and then my fourth is usually a delay that's based on the tempo of the song. So like I could set my timing to where it's either the repeats happen every eighth note or every quarter note or however, whatever rhythmic value I chose to assign. But we'll get into all that later in the series. For right now, we just know that we need to create 4 aux inputs. And we will title these. We've got our room, verb, our slap, our long verb, and our long delay, our tempo delay. Now, and again, this is just my perspective, but since I usually default to this when I'm starting a mix to these four time-based effects, I usually just always make them the last 4 stereo buses available. So 1718, 1920, 21, 22, and 23, 24. And that way I just always know where they are. I'm just in the habit of that. And the way we get to these is with our send points. So, for example, I know I'm going to want my vocal in the slap delay. So this brings up this other fader. So this fader is parallel with this one. So this one controls the contribution to the master mix. This one controls the contribution to our new aux channel, which in this case will have a slap delay on it. I'm not going to go through and do this with the whole mix because that's really more of a later on mix process. I just wanted to show you from a routing side how that works, since we're talking about routing altogether. One more thing that I will typically do, again, this might be a little unorthodox, but just for the sake of showing you my opinion, I also will create 4 VCAs. What a VCA in Pro Tools is, this has a separate meaning in the analog world, but in Pro Tools, a VCA is a fader that you can assign to a mix group. I always use 4 of them, and what this allows you to do is, as you mix, if you find that you've gotten yourself in a hole in some form or another, these can kind of be a safeguard for that. These are also a safeguard for automation, which is something that we'll talk about later. But again, just for the sake of routing, I'm showing you this now. So I always use 4. 1 is always my drums. And I've already titled that because that's our drum bus, so drum VCA. My second one is always all of my instruments except for my drums. So this will be instruments. My third one is always lead vocals. And my fourth one is always effects. So the way that we get over to these is we go to our groups. Well, one way that it would normally happen is assigning it to a group, but since we have assigned all of our drum channels to a drum bus, this bus is now effectively a master fader for the drums. But remember, we've also moved our kick drum to this bass bus. So if we wanted to control the summation of the drums, we would need something that moves the faders of both the drum bus and the kick channel itself. So if we go here and create a group, and we'll call this drums VCA. We can assign VCA to drums. So now this fader, here, I'll move it so you can see what it does. Controls those two channels. As I get through the rest of this, you'll kind of start to see why that will be beneficial. So we've done that. Now we want our instruments. So we have a bass. We have a bass. We have a guitar bus. And then for me, I typically include my ancillary parts in this as well, since these kind of become almost like synth pads, like not really a lyrical idea, just a musical idea with a vocal, like using the vocal as an instrument. So create this group, we'll call this instruments, and assign that to our second VCA. So now, we'll put this kind of where you can see it here. So now this moves those faders. So if you think about it, we've created, with our busing, we've created group processors and faders for our individual parts, like drums, bass, guitar, background vocals. With these VCAs, we've created effectively groups of groups. So like I said, if you find that you're getting into trouble, like you're getting into a mix and down the road you realize that your instruments are too loud and they're swallowing your vocals, rather than going through and changing your fader balance, which we'll talk about here in a minute, you can just bump the VCA faders down or bump the vocal VCA fader up. Another thing that these come in handy for is when you get to automating, in Pro Tools at least, when you write automation to a channel, like specifically fader automation, the fader of that channel is no longer movable like outside of playback. Once you write automation to something, which again, we'll talk about this all later, I'm just for the sake of usefulness, when you write automation to something, that fader goes away. So rather than writing automation to your channel faders where you might want to change a balance later on, you can write your automation to these VCA faders so it stays separate but achieves the same effect. So we also just have our final VCA to make, which is our effects. Assign it to our last VCA. And there we go. So that is a routed session. So now, it's really only one last step, although it is a crucial and important step, before we can start applying processing and populating these insert points and doing that fun stuff. The last stage before we really mix is creating a fader balance or a rough mix. There are a couple of philosophies at play here, predominantly where the faders start, where you begin working from. In the analog days, when you were working with a mixing console, typically the board was known as was zeroed out, meaning any of the processors were not in play and the faders were pulled all the way down, like so. This was called a fader down mix. So what you would do is rather than working from unity and adjusting your relative levels from 0, you'd be adjusting your relative levels from negative infinity. You'd, quote, push your faders up to create your mix. Now, in the Pro Tools realm, this is how channels are defaulted at Unity. This would be known as a fader up mix. There are various philosophies about which is better and which you should use. For me, what I've found that I like is beginning with all of my faders at unity, but building my mix as I go. So let me show you what I mean. Go over here and we can mute these things. Another handy use of the VCAs is they can act as mute groups. Okay, so let me get out of my grouping here. So what I'll do is I'll just I'll start with a single part at unity and then add a second part, adjust it relative to that part, and then just keep moving. Some people like to start with the vocal and work back from there, since that will obviously be like the predominant part. For me, I typically just go left to right because for the most part, I tend to be in what I would consider a fortunate situation of also being the one to record the songs that I mix. So I tend to set my gains in recording and my tape send levels in recording such that stuff will kind of be pre-fader balanced anyway as it's being recorded. If you don't have that luxury, maybe you would want to start your fader balance relative to the lead vocal, but everyone finds their own way of doing it. So start with my kick drum. I'll get to a playback spot. And it sounds pretty quiet right now because it's unprocessed, but that's okay. So that'll be our 0 point. That's where we're going to be working back from. But then we've got our next part is going to be our snare. But before we can mix that with the kick drum, we got to mix the perspectives of the snare. So let's get to a section here. Something like that. Then we can mix this with our kick. Then we can add our hi-hat. Let's find a spot where it's in play. I know this stuff's quiet, but that'll all come up in processing. But for now, we'll set it as this. Toms. That's probably fine as is. Overheads, room perspective. Something like that. So there's our drum mix, and then we can just keep adding from left to right. So you can bring in our instruments and get rid of these because we're not ready for them yet. We can add our bass. And then we can start setting a relative mix of the guitars. So we're going to temporarily mute our drums and bass and just mix the guitars. Find a spot where they're all in. Here at the end. So for me, this is probably, that's the predominant part, so we're going to blend from this one. need to blend the harmony parts. So for that, we need to get out of our grouping. Oh, I'm also making the critical error of not blending my multiple perspectived acoustic parts. Aha. So we got to get out of these groups here. See how this is all top end. We're going to blend in the body here. So we can remute that and come over and do the same thing to our BGs. So we got to get out of the overall group and start blending. So we can set that blend with everything else. Something like that. So we notice that it's at unity, but it's a little, it could probably come up a little bit. This is just my opinion, but typically I try not to cross 0 on any of my faders across my mix. That way, you can ensure that when it's summed, it's not going to be too loud and clip out your master bus. So come back to our VCAs, and we can drop the drums and the instruments by, say 1.5 decibels each, by the same amount. So now those fader balances remain as they were, but now I have a little bit more room to play with the vocal.
Step back from a ledge that you stand on. Look down the canyons, molded by standing still when I've tried for so long.
All right, so there's a fader balance, sort of, but there's one other step to this. And again, there are differing philosophies with how this should be done. Pan pots are also, to me, part of the fader balance. Some people think that not only should you fader balance with all your pan pots either centered or hard left and right, but you shouldn't pan anything until after you've processed. The thinking behind this is that you won't be able to perceive all the potential frequency masking unless you're listening to everything in mono, because stereo separation might make it appear as though two frequencies are not covering each other when in fact they might be. For me, I tend to like to set my fader balance and my stereo imaging from the beginning before I start processing. That is, again, just a taste thing, but my kick and my snare are going to stay in mono. Again, I'm going to just go ahead and quickly pan these as I would if I were mixing this. Everybody has their own way, but I typically kick my hi-hats off to the right a little bit. If I've got two toms, I typically put the rack on the left and the floor on the right, kind of midway, kind of like this. So again, this is just changing the balance, the amount of this signal that's going to the left and the right stereo channel, the summation of this entire mix. Well, in this case, it's changing the pan that goes to the drum bus, which in turn translates to the master mix. So we've got this. There's also this neat trick that I picked up where if you throw a mono to stereo processor on a mono channel and bypass it, you can cheat it to a stereo channel. So in my case, I like to have, if I've got only two overheads and one room mic, I'll keep my overheads hard left and right, and then I'll reverse pan my cheated to stereo room mic, which kind of creates like a 360 effect in the headphones, like in stereo of the room, of the acoustic space. So then I've got my bass, which I want to keep in mono. Guitars I want to keep away from the center, so there's plenty of space for my mono information. So let's say I'm going to put this first acoustic on the right side. I typically like to go about 60%, and this other one on the left. Now this is a lead part, so I'm going to keep that in mono for now. That might end up getting moved in the mixed, but this electric part, since it's kind of like an embellishing tremolo part, I'm going to cheat that to stereo as well. Maybe make this, say, 75% left and right. Something like this. Vocal definitely needs to be kept in mono. The doubling can stay hard left and right. This is where you're really going to get in to your, where the stereo imaging is really going to come in. For me, I might tend to fan these a little bit. So like, I'm going to put my highest part on the outside. So like hard left, hard right, and then since I've got triple tracks, I can control like which side gets more of a bias of which part. So I'm gonna double this one on the right. Then the next part down, I'm gonna make just inside of that, maybe say something like this, left, right, and then since we bias the other part on the right, we're gonna bias this one to the left. Again, these are purely my opinion, just how I've like gotten to do things. Next part in, we're gonna go just inside of the previous one, left and right, and then back on the right, just keeping it all balanced and even. And then this last part, and then maybe I'll do the same thing to these. Just for the sake of time, I'm just gonna make them all hard, left, right. Yep, so now we've fader balanced and panned. So now preliminarily our song, just before we begin to add processing, sounds like this.
Take a step back from the ledge that you stand on. Look down the canyons, molded by standing still when I've tried for so long. Take a step back from the ledge that you stand on. Look down the canyons, molded by standing still when I've tried for so long.
Kick, your snare, your bass, and your lead vocal are all like right up the center, have their own
I
space,
can't
plenty of room to breathe. So those are the routing considerations and the rough mix considerations. One thing that I aspire to do is, once a piece has been recorded, edited, routed, laid out as we have it, and then rough mixed, is I try as best I'm able, while I'm processing, to not change my fader balance. The reason for that is when mixing, you typically don't want to be adding or subtracting gain with your processors. Remember, the compressors like have input and output gains. You kind of want that all to stay level, because that way you'll be able to stay objective about your mix, because just because something sounds louder doesn't necessarily mean it's better, but you'll perceive it as better compared to something that's quieter. So I try, and obviously like some tweaks are going to happen as you go, but for the most part, I try to keep my beginning fader balance the same as I'm processing. The only time this fader balance will change is after everything has been processed to my satisfaction, and we move into the final stage of the mix, which is automating, where these faders will change dynamically with the song as each section commands. But as it is right now, is a solid general starting point for the entire song. We'll get into automating, obviously, later in this course. That is typically the final stage of a mix after all the processing has occurred. But yeah, this is the routing and layout stage and rough mix stage that has to happen between your edit and your actual nuts and bolts mixing, applying the EQ and the compression that we talked about the last 2 weeks. And then we'll talk later about filling in some of these, adding some time-based effects to your mix. Yeah, starting next week, we're going to begin our discussion of individual recording and mix techniques for specific parts. So next week, we're going to talk about drums and bass together. We're going to talk about recording techniques, miking techniques, EQ and compression, best practices, all that stuff pertaining to drums and bass. So yeah, hope to see you there. And until then, thanks for watching.